Good evening, everyone. I'm Sophie Black, the editor of Crikey, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre for our debate with Robert Manne, Professor of Politics at La Trobe University, regular contributor to The Monthly, and author of the latest quarterly essay, Bad News, Murdoch's Australian and the Shaping of the Nation. Now, in this essay, Robert labels The Australian the country's most important newspaper, the only genuinely national general newspaper, extremely well-resourced and able to employ many of Australia's best journalists. He also labels it a remorseless campaigning paper, unusually self-referential and boastful, notoriously sensitive to criticism, bears many grudges, explodes with criticism and rage when criticised, has an intensely aggressive culture, and perhaps most importantly, Robert suggests that the paper exercises power without responsibility. All of which prompted an initial 1,800-word response from The Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly. Now, unfortunately, as most of you have no doubt now heard, Paul Kelly pulled out of this event, which doesn't make for much of a debate. So given that we're keen to ensure that the views of The Australian are adequately represented tonight, I'd like to introduce a special guest. May I present to read aloud from Paul Kelly's response to Manne, entitled Man Throws Truth Overboard, Mr. Max Gillies.
This will be no laughing matter. There are four themes in Manne's essay that deserve to be highlighted. First, he claims The Australian has damaged the country and undermined journalism by publishing material and conducting debates that he feels should be repressed. Second, his focus is largely on editorials. With the exception of his attack on foreign editor Greg Sheridan, Manne makes no serious critique of the stance of any of The Australian's senior political analysts. He believes that the paper has damaged our democracy, but he cannot identify the guilty journalists who have perpetrated this crime. Third, Manne assumes that the paper's coverage of numerous issues is invalid, notably stories critical of the Rudd government, yet he fails to mount an intellectual case showing how and why such stories are unjustified. Finally, despite an interview of nearly 2 hours with Editor-in-Chief Chris Mitchell and me, where replies were offered point by point, Manne fails to publish any of these responses, a strange position for an academic preaching fairness. I want to analyse Manne's essay for its perspective on journalism and then on politics. First, journalism. The startling feature is Manne's fixation on repressing stories and debates that he doesn't like. He is a moralistic political censor. We see this clearly in his first case study, his attack on The Australian for staging a debate on Keith Windschuttle's book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History. Manne concedes that the paper published opinions which were roughly equal. Yet he condemns the paper for making the book a national event and treating it as highly significant. Manne's emotionalism is quite clear. He loathes Windschuttle for striking at what Manne regards as the almost uncontested common wisdom that Australia was founded on a genocide, and for reviving the old racial attitudes. He asserts that whatever of worth the paper did in Indigenous affairs was sullied by any coverage of Windschuttle. For Manne, the paper's crime was to stage this debate. He believes certain views had reached uncontested status and must not be contested. Books and views that differ are to be met with silence and censorship. It's good that Manne's technique of handling opponents is put on the public record. His own argument betrays the folly of such pomposity. Manne is attached to the idea of Australia being founded on genocide. This view, however, is contested on intellectual grounds despite its academic proponents, and there is no justification whatsoever for Manne's effort to remove it from debate. This is blatant intellectual censorship. Manne says that his original motive for the essay was his concern at the paper's coverage of climate change. He argues that because there's a consensus among scientists on the core issue, then debate between unqualified people, virtually everybody, on the fundamentals is pointless, even absurd. He says we have no option but to rely upon experts. The opinions of those without true knowledge and understanding are worthless. And wisdom is found exclusively in those published in peer-reviewed journals. Manne says that on climate change, our democracy must rely on citizens placing their trust in those with expertise. Again, the idea is that certain beliefs cannot be debated or contested. For Manne, Mitchell's unforgivable sin was to violate this view. His charge is that under Mitchell the paper campaigned against the values of the Enlightenment, science and reason. This from a critic who claims the paper's style is overbearing. He says that while the newspaper never formally abandoned the scientific consensus, its editorials welcomed climate change challenges and it published totally unqualified lay people who denied that the science was settled. Once again, the paper's offence was its refusal to shut down debate. Period. Manne insists his view embodies Enlightenment rationality. During our interview, to stress the gravity of his position on climate change, he actually compared the issue with the Holocaust. I told Manne that one reason for the public's backlash making carbon pricing so unpopular was the precise attitude that he took. While pretending to be rational, his rejection of debate was really faith-based dogmatism. And the Australian public didn't like being told what to think by patronising experts. I also told Manne the best pro-science approach was the insurance principle. Because there was climate change risk, everybody could see the prudent path was to take out mitigating policy insurance, as distinct from being intimidated by Manne's hectoring dogmatism. You can agree or disagree that the Australian questioned the science too much, but Manne's view of the relationship between science and democracy is extreme, and his framework raises many questions. Who decides who are the experts? What sort of prospect does this debate denial mean for public policy? Central to his essay is Manne's political framework. He accuses the Australian of being a very important catalyst in Kevin Rudd's destruction. He's desperate to nail the paper with some responsibility for Rudd's demise. He spins a long saga about the personal relationship between Mitchell and Rudd that would better fit a tabloid romance rag. But at the end, he's left with schoolboy scribblings, namely that the paper had become a key player, that it had tasted blood and had helped crystallise opposition to Rudd in caucus. Yet there is little evidence that the pro-Gillard push of June 2010 was inspired by the Australian. What happened is that the caucus lost confidence in Rudd. The Australian did not campaign to remove Rudd. Its political editor, Dennis Shanahan, did not argue that Rudd had to go. The Australians' criticism of the Rudd government over 2009 and 2010 was stronger than other papers, but the question Manne never poses is whether that coverage was justified. This is the question that counts. The paper led criticism of Rudd on many fronts. It exposed blunders in the stimulus package, from home insulation to BER funds, lamented labour market re-regulation, criticised Rudd's switch on boats, attacked his paralysis and retreat on climate change, and ran hard on the mining tax flaws. Political coverage is always imperfect, but there is much evidence to buttress the view that the Australian read this period better than other media outlets and better identified the genuine flaws in Rudd's style and politics. Manne implies that stories were driven by personality and ideology, as if this motivated individual journalists. The truth is, however, that the Rudd government was unravelling. Julia Gillard herself said that Rudd had lost his way. The paper wrote, reported and analysed one of the most remarkable collapses in our history, the destruction of a first-term Prime Minister. Man cannot confront the core truth. Here, Rudd undermined himself. It was his own work. Man is so sure that the Murdoch hand must be involved that he misrepresents the contemporary history. He is an unreliable witness. His essay is filled with such examples. But consider just one of the most spectacular, the mining tax. Manne accuses the paper of trying to kill the mining tax. He avoids any fair account of what happened. The Rudd government ambushed the industry. It failed to negotiate with the states over royalties, flouted the Hawke-Keating technique of consultation to cut a deal, waged a class-based campaign, misread the impact of the tax, and misjudged the reaction of both opposition and the industry. Labor broke every rule in the tax reform book. This was reflected in the paper's daily coverage, although Manne cannot accept such political realities. Manne overall seems confused about the essential problem with the Australian. He has two contradictory positions: that Rupert Murdoch is an omnipresent, manipulating his global empire, creating difficulties for Australian democracy, yet on the other hand, his problem is Chris Mitchell's power as editor-in-chief, exercised in too aggressive and too personal a manner. On the Iraq War, for instance, Murdoch is depicted as global tyrant, demanding all his papers back the war. On climate change, however, Manne attacks Mitchell for not following Murdoch's position of giving the planet the benefit of the doubt, nor acting on Murdoch's view about its catastrophic threat. Does Mitchell have editorial independence, or does he not? In reality, Manne is confused. While he's written 40,000 words, he doesn't know how the Australian works. At one point he notes that Mitchell persuaded Murdoch to change his mind and endorse Rudd at the 2007 election. At another point, while damning the paper's position on the Iraq War, he notes the pluralism on the op-ed page with articles for and against the war. How does this square with the tyrant's dictates? And there's another possibility beyond the realm of Manne's mind, that the Australian has struck an effective balance of strong editorial independence within a global corporation headed by a strong chief executive committed to newspapers. And that is the summary of my case against Manne's quarterly essay. Anyone who wants to know what's in my Australian column next week should read anyone else's column from last week. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, now, in the interest of being fair and balanced, to quote another great Murdoch outlet, I'm going to be playing the role of the rest of the Australian tonight, or at least the 6 people who further responded to your essay, Robert, in the double-page spread featured in the Weekend Australian last Saturday. And that's not including the editorial or the cartoon, but we'll get to that later. Now, we've got half an hour to cover off on something like, 14,000 words worth of response? So we need to keep this short and sharp, and then we'll throw to questions from the audience. So, Robert, I'm going to start by putting a Paul Kelly line of argument to you. The startling feature is man's fixation on repressing stories and debates he doesn't like. He is a moralistic political censor. Books and views that contest man's beliefs are to be met with silence and censorship. So, Rob, why do you seek to censor views, particularly when it comes to criticising the Australian for elevating Keith Windschuttle's book or criticising the decision to publish laypeople on climate science?
Yes, before I answer that question, can I say that I did answer Paul Kelly, aka Max Gillies or vice versa, and I've put down the back of, by the reading stall, printouts of what is a fairly lengthy rebuttal. It was such an eloquent speech given by Max that I would like people who are interested, if they want, to get that.
That's
now, on the question of repressing debate, a number of points, which I have to be quick. Firstly, I've spent my life trying to debate. I'm one of the few academics that have written for a very long time a column, edited Quadrant, as some people will remember, in the 1990s. I've been involved with the Monthly recently. I've asked for a debate and finally got a debate with Andrew Bolt. I've had a debate with Keith Windschuttle. I thought I had a debate with Paul Kelly. So I know I'm trying to suppress him by inviting him, and I successfully managed it. Another point to be made is I'm a censor, and I really do want to make this point. There have been 14,000 words against me. I don't mind. When people heard that I was doing the quarterly essay, they looked at me as if I had recontracted cancer, saying, "Do you know what you're in for?" And I do. And I did. And I didn't. And what they've done is expected. What has taken me totally by surprise is that after 14,000 words, I applied for a right of reply and was refused, even an opinion column. Now, I'm the person that's meant to be suppressing debate. But let's take the 2 issues now that you raised, and I'll do them as quickly as I can. In my view, newspapers have to make judgments as to what they decide to debate, what they don't decide to debate. I think, against Windschuttle, what has to be said is that he is the most reactionary historian since the 1960s, maybe earlier, that Australia's seen. His case that Tasmanian Aboriginal people were criminals in trying to defend their way of life and so on seems to me to be disgusting. And he also, his argument that we can know that only 120 Tasmanian Aboriginal people were killed is absurd. He's a very bad historian. So my case is that there are literally hundreds of books in the humanities that are published, and that the Australian made an error of judgment. I don't want to censor Keith Windschuttle. He's able to self-publish all he wants. But I think it was an ideologically determined and very consequential error of judgment, is the way I put it, in deciding to have a national debate on an absurd and such reactionary book. On climate change, the case is a bit different. Kelly completely misrepresents my position. Essentially, what I argue is that in an area like climate science, as in an area like nuclear physics, reason tells you that there cannot be debates between lay people. Actually, as a joke, I said, maybe Paul Kelly and I could have a debate about the finer points of climate science. to make fools of ourselves in front of this audience. So what I'm saying is the idea that, say, Christopher Pearson, who had 21 columns telling us what the science meant, is just a failure of simple reason. Kelly also seems to suggest that I think we shouldn't have a debate about climate change, but that's again a total misrepresentation. I think we have to have an absolutely detailed debate about what the scientists tell us. But I believe a paper has the responsibility to represent what is essentially the consensual core of climate science. And I think the paper has it's what I call a sort of mixture of intellectual muddle and ideological prejudice, leads it into the position of generally confusing the public on this issue. I'm not trying to shut down debate on climate science. And if there was a debate to be had between, the finer points of that, 99% of science that agree on the core, it would bore the readers silly and they wouldn't understand it, but I wouldn't be objecting to that. But having cranks, contrarians and lay people who couldn't and haven't passed a first-year exam in climate science debating it is cause of general confusion and has made the issue of climate science climate change legislation far more difficult than it ought to be.
I think Paul Kelly also argued that the Australian people don't like to be lectured by experts.
I just don't think it's true. I mean, I said lectured is a loaded word, but I think Australian people want to find out what experts believe. I mean, if you had the professor of one of the climate sciences from the University of Melbourne writing lucidly in The Australian about where the state of the debate is, I actually think Australian people would be extremely interested if it could be done lucidly. The other thing is that we rely on experts all the time. I say in the response to Kelly, if one develops a cancer, one goes to an oncologist, not to an astrologist. If you want to build a bridge, you rely on experts. I don't think people are doubtful about experts. We live according to our reliance on experts in many different ways.
The paper has also argued in the past that it is partly a reflection of the public, and climate science in the public's mind is still very confused, and that they are merely reflecting that sentiment.
Well, I agree that they're reflecting the confusion, but they're also creating it. I mean, what I call for is not to censor anything but clear thinking. And I think it is the duty of the newspapers and duty of radio and television to try and maintain clear thinking on these issues, to try and say just what I've said, that there are some things that are difficult and you just have to listen to those that have knowledge and understanding, or we're all in total confusion. I think now you have reached, not really in Europe so much as I understand it, but in the United States and Australia, a state of total confusion about climate science. So in the United States, if you vote Republican, you tend not to believe in climate science, whereas if you vote Democrat, you're more likely to believe in it. It's just absurd.
But how much is that also a reflection of the current political climate and the opposition's role in the climate debate?
Yeah, I think that's a role. I think also a very big role in the confusion are the interests, the mining companies and so on, who have a vested interest in us not being able to come to a decision on the phasing out of carbon dioxide emissions. I think there's a lot of explanations for the confusion, and I think I've become what I say comically, but it'll no doubt be taken seriously at The Australian, I've become a vulgar Marxist. I actually think that the corporate interests have deliberately created the climate of uncertainty. Uncertainty is their weapon in this, and by consistent public propaganda, they've created enough confusion about climate science to make reasonable legislation more difficult.
Going back very quickly to the Wind Shuttle book and the criticism of the paper's decision to elevate that book and to give it the space that it did, The Australian is often commended for the column inches that it devotes to Indigenous issues, and that's something that Chris Mitchell is very proud of. Does that count for something? It
does count for something, and in the quarterly essay I praise three people in particular, Paul Toohey, but particularly Tony Koch, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, and Nicholas Rothwell, who I think have done marvellous reporting. And I do think as a newspaper it has done the most important reporting of any newspaper in the country. And I say that and I mean it. On the other hand, I'm afraid I'm also critical of parts of that coverage, very quickly for two reasons. One is that I think It's what I call univocalism. They have Noel Pearson and people like him as their spokespeople. They don't allow other voices to enter sufficiently, and there are many Aboriginal intellectuals who have a different point of view. We would be, as it were, nourished by that debate. The other thing is that I actually think they've begun to campaign on the intervention in the Northern Territory. I think they no longer are reporting the problems, the unintended consequences that have arisen, as far as I understand it, so that their readers get a very biased view or a jaundiced view of where the Aboriginal opposition lies and why there might be some. So I think there is praise, but I also think there is problem.
Okay, so let's move on to your second case study in the essay, which is the invasion of Iraq. Now, in your essay, you said that one of the greatest weaknesses of Chris Mitchell's editorship is that he has allowed Greg Sheridan to remain his foreign editor throughout. That's pretty scathing. Sheridan responded in quite a hurt tone on Saturday. "Man demands an apology from me, but no one else for supporting the Iraq war. I certainly don't apologise," and this is edited slightly. "Man abuses me for reporting the conclusion of many analysts that Saddam consciously cultivated the idea that he had more WND than he really did to intimidate his population and neighbours." Why are you so scathing of Sheridan and the paper's support for the war, a war that they were certainly not alone in supporting at the time?
Yeah. Firstly, it's just not true. I don't call for Greg Sheridan to apologise. I couldn't care less about that. I called for the paper to apologise, for the editors, as the New York Times did, and they were much less egregious in the way they supported the war. In other words, it seems to me that there should have been a statement from the Australian saying we made a very significant error. But what I hold against Greg Sheridan is, I think he's an intelligent person, and I say that in the essay. He's one of the more intelligent writers on foreign affairs in this country. But what I think is wrong with him is what I call judgment, and his incapacity to learn from his mistakes. For example, he at one point said that George W. Bush was as great as Winston Churchill. Now that seems to me to be, so ludicrous that only someone, with serious problems of judgment. But what I really hold against him, Churchill is a great man, and George Bush is not a great man. I don't want to mock him, more than is usual.
I'm not going to argue with you on that one. No.
Okay. But what I really hold against him is that he creates a tone in his writing when he was drumming for war or when he was criticising opponents. I wrote moderate columns in The Age at the time, asking real questions, and it's derision, contempt, sarcasm, self-confidence, beating of his own chest, arrogance, I have to say, which I think, because he held such a central position in foreign affairs debate in this country, is very damaging to the national debate. I think one of the most intelligent people in this area in the country is Hugh White. He said he was a total fool. No one in a senior position in Australian government has ever been a greater total fool, Hugh White. He writes at that level, and I think it's an intimidating and a childish tone, and I think because of his narrowness and his lack of judgment and his lack of openness on all sorts of questions, I do mean seriously that it's been one of the great weaknesses of the paper.
You do make the point in the essay, though, that the opinion editor at the time, Tom Switzer, did not necessarily support the war, and you're very careful to make that point. So it didn't trickle down to all areas of the paper necessarily, the support for the war.
And I've never said that there's no area in which there's no area where everything is monolithic. It's that would be an exaggeration. I haven't made that case. The columns, Tom is a conservative, and he's a follower of Owen Harries, who was a conservative realist who was opposed to the war, and Tom was opposed to it and ran sort of really American articles from the realist position, which I suspect people in Australia didn't even understand the context of, but nevertheless he did that. But John Howard said, when he was speaking about the Australian, "Thank you, you gave me very great support for the war." The editorials, the headlines, the reports, which usually I read printouts for the essay because I didn't go down to the State Library to look at the real paper. But on the Iraq War, I went to look at the real paper. And the headlines, huge banner headlines, "Tyrants beware," it was drumming for war. And it was distorting, I quote in the essay, a distortion of a very cautious report from Hans Blix about the question of weapons of mass destruction when they were inspecting Iraq, totally distorted in the editorial. And so I think it bears a lot of responsibility, and I believe it would be, in terms of a reasonable culture, if terrible mistakes, I think there might be up to 400,000 deaths and millions of refugees. I think people who beat the drum for war ought to say, we were wrong and we regret what we did, and we'll try and explain how we got to that position. I actually thought Chris Mitchell smiled when I asked him whether he had any regrets.
Why is it so important for the paper to apologise?
Because if you don't, then what's learnt? And how does a culture progress if mistakes are not... It's like in private life. If one makes a major mistake, it seems the only way, as it were, you can move from that is to reflect upon what went wrong. Readers
have short memories, though, don't they? Do they remember...
Not this one.
Well, not you. Not you. But honestly, the casual reader, do they remember the Australians' record on that and still judge them on that?
I think they do. I think some do. How can I know? But my suspicion is, I actually think there's a lot of feeling about what's wrong with the Australian in the community amongst educated, people. It's not a tabloid newspaper, and I think people do remember, and I think they store memory. And even if they don't, my point about regret, an expression of apology for serious errors of judgment, when they're so consequential as the death of that many people, it seems to me sort of basic to the good health of a civic culture.
The Australian wasn't alone in terms of News Corp papers to support the Iraq War.
It certainly wasn't.
In fact, every single one of them did.
Around the world, yeah.
But the notion that Rupert Murdoch is on the end of the phone yelling at the editor to ensure that they support the Iraq War, that's nonsensical, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, by accident I know an example. I was travelling in Tasmania around about 2004, and I was talking about wind shuttle, in fact. I've remembered that for a long time. And a journalist there, when I was talking, almost went white, and I'll say he said, God, I've got to tell you a story now. We were running a line against the Iraq War in our editorials, and the boss in Sydney contacted us and told us to change. And I went and looked at the Hobart Mercury, and it was a completely new editorial line. So it's not as direct as Rupert Murdoch on the phone, although whether he's on the phone to the editor of the Times or the Australian, I wouldn't be sure he wasn't if they'd taken the wrong line. But it filters down. Plus the other thing is, I think a comment that Orwell once made, that the really well-trained circus dog is the one that jumps without having to see the whip. They know what's expected. But what Kelly implies in his thing is that 175 papers worldwide spontaneously came to the same decision, when in general the war was unpopular with the general community in many countries in the world.
You speak about the savviness of readers and the fact that some of them don't forget. I'm going to quote Chris Kenny from his piece on Saturday Now, and he said, "Man betrays a low opinion of the public. He's not concerned for the politically engaged citizens, but about the capacity of News Limited to influence the opinions of the vast majority of less engaged citizens. This narrative has the mainstream as supplicants whose views are bestowed on them by the media. It is condescending." Yeah,
this is the populist line that now is one of the really damaging lines in our culture. It is common sense to say that most people don't follow political issues carefully, except when they impact on them directly, as they often do. If it's in a local community, I think people follow with incredible care if something about their local community is being destroyed. But they don't follow major events carefully. So if you can influence the way in which the 6 o'clock news goes, the current affairs programs go, your local radio goes, then you do affect public opinion. And it's not condescending to say that. That's just populism to say that you can't admit something as obvious as that. We know from surveys that people are remarkably unknowledgeable about lots of topics, so that single lines coming down in the end from newspaper coverage does have an effect on public opinion. And that's why it's so damaging to have such a politically active person as Rupert Murdoch owning 70% of the readership of the Australian newspapers.
Well, let's go back to the subject that inspired you to start writing the essay in the first place, global warming. Now, you wrote, "What the Australian has contributed on climate change under Chris Mitchell's watch has been a truly frightful hodgepodge of ideological prejudice and intellectual muddle." Now, Graham Lloyd, the environment editor, responded on Saturday, "The Australian certainly fostered a broad discussion, but has acknowledged the agreed science and been clear in its preference for considered action over an unrestrained response. Experience has proved that judgment to be correct." Hasn't the Australian always supported the science?
It's just an astonishing statement, not from you, from Graham Lloyd. I mean, I go at pains to show, and people that read the Quarterly Essay will know this, that time and again in their editorials they said the science isn't settled. I'll give a simple example. There was this horrid documentary that the ABC showed called The Great Global Warming Swindle. What did the Australian do? They cheered. It was terrific to see the science being challenged. But there is example after example after example where in the editorials they said, you know, the science is very unsettled. It's possible that global warming is a mirage. Nothing is established here. And I document, because he'd said it previously, I documented pains. It was actually an interesting response from Graham Lloyd. It's as if he doesn't bother to read what I say in order to reply to it. I just couldn't believe it when I read that. It's one of the things I would say if I was allowed to write a reply.
Was there a discernible shift, though, at some point which seemed to acknowledge that, yes, there was something to the science?
No, it went in and out. You know, you could find statements where they say the science seems to suggest this, and then 2 weeks later they say something else. There's an element of stream of consciousness or something, but it's certainly, on the question of science, they just go in and out of support for the science. And then when, say, the University of East Anglia emails were leaked, they were incredibly delighted that the consensus was breaking down. The climate scientists were supposedly shown to be fraudulent. Then 4 inquiries showed that the University of East Anglia emails didn't say what the denialists purported they said. Not a word in the Australian about that.
Surely they reported that.
No.
Not a word?
Well, in the editorials, I didn't see one article which, well, I can't recall now one article, but I certainly in the editorials, I read every editorial, 350 or so, over a 7-year period.
Did you in that analysis, did you distinguish between a page 1 story and a page 27 story?
No, I did an analysis of 880 stories, and I couldn't, you know, if you distinguish too many things, you just lose, you know. But I read 880 articles, not the editorials, which I analysed separately. Of those 880, 700 fell under the category, in my view, judgment, of not favourable to action on climate change, and 180 about were favourable, so a 4-to-1 ratio against action on climate change. Also, if you look at, denialism in the opinion columns versus the support for the science, I think amongst scientists it's 10-to-1 in favour of the contrarians, whereas in the real world it's like 99-to-1 against the contrarians. So I'm not mathematical enough to know that kind of skewing that involves, but it's in the thousands of percent.
But the Australian came out with an editorial the day after the details of the carbon tax were announced, supporting the carbon tax. So how does that square with their position?
Well, they go in and out, and the carbon tax at that time, I can't explain the stream of consciousness particularly, but the carbon tax was moderate enough. You'll see from the essay that if the carbon tax or the ETS is extremely moderate, if business interests are fully accommodated, etc., then from time to time they're in favour of it. But I'll give you another example. They were strongly in favour of Malcolm Turnbull, and they actually said the coalition will be destroyed if they go against the Turnbull policy and go with Abbott. A few months later, they praise Abbott for having saved the coalition from a ridiculous policy.
Can't a paper's editorial line change its mind based on emerging facts?
Yeah, so long as they are aware, so long as it's not just waking up on which side of the bed and saying the next thing. And so there's an inconsistency where, say, we did argue for this, but we now realise that, which I think is very good. It'd be ridiculous to stick always to the same thing. But on the other hand, if you feel that they lurch from one thing to another... But anyhow, the main point is that a lot of the things they said were hostile to anything that looks like real action, and certainly hostile to the idea that the science is settled.
Speaking of Rudd, let's move on to the
Can
down...
I say, so I'm not misunderstood. When I say the science is settled, I mean the consensual core. The questions of at what rate, how quick the acidification of the oceans will happen, what the rate of extinctions of species will be, that's not settled. We all know that. What's settled is the relation of emissions of carbon dioxide to the globing of the warming of the planet.
Robert. Moving on to the downfall of Rudd. Chris Mitchell wrote to you on Saturday and the general public, man alone of all pundits and politicians we have spoken to this past year thinks this newspaper brought down Kevin Rudd. Never mind Mr Rudd could not muster a single supporter for a spill and had to walk away from the Prime Ministership. Is it overestimating the Australians' power to suggest that it brought down a Prime Minister?
Yes, but I didn't suggest it. If you look at the essay, I say there are two ways of misunderstanding this. One would be to overestimate the role of the paper, and I say Rudd was far too isolated. The other way is to leave out the role of the paper in the effect it had on the members of caucus. What I've tried to do, and perhaps I could have put it in a way that people in Australia would understand, what I've tried to do is add an element to the analysis of the fall of Rudd. It's not an attempt to give a comprehensive explanation. But I was astonished when I looked consistently at the mining tax coverage. Day after day for 6 weeks, they reported the gossip coming out from the mining companies about the disaster that was to befall Australia. And in my view, that played a role, because every member of caucus, I would think, would read The Australian. That would play a role, I think, in building up the feeling against Rudd.
Isn't that newsworthy, though? Isn't that worth reporting, that kind of conversation?
Well, I don't think... I think if the public relations elements of the mining companies is putting out propaganda, it needs to be tested. Time and again you're being told that billions of dollars of investment are not going to go ahead if the mining tax happens. It's not tested. There's not one person that's quoted as saying it. It is said that BHP Billiton will withdraw X billion dollars of investment. And what if a reader of intelligence sees what's coming out is people in the public relations area will spend $100 million on advertising, but we'll also put out this PAP.
How should a paper test an assertion like that?
It should partly ask for that. If that's true, then executives should put their name to the claim, and it should ask questions of others. Do you think this is right? It should test, probe, work out. But what you had is day after day of scaremongering in the guise of reporting. In my view, again, people will have to read the essay. I go on at almost embarrassing length to try and show how skewed and how sort of remorseless. And I came upon only one pro-mining tax article on the front page over that 6-week period from Ross Garnaut, who said it was an elegant tax. 3 days later said, however, it had big problems.
I'm going to ask you about one more case study before we move on to questions, and that's the Larissa Behrendt story. Now, Paul Kelly wrote, "Man accuses the Australian of protracted character assassination of Aboriginal lawyer and activist Larissa Behrendt. Frankly, he should have left this alone. The issue arose from the Australian story after Behrendt tweeted of Indigenous woman Bess Price that watching a show where a guy had sex with a horse was less offensive than Bess Price. It is hard to conjure a more lethal slur." Now, Robert, wasn't this a newsworthy story, or, as Kelly put it, a piercing and ongoing insight into the depth of political and values tensions in Aboriginal society? Okay.
There is no part of the essay of which I'm more proud than the thing I've written about Larissa Behrendt. In my view, it was one of the most disgraceful, protracted character assassinations I've seen in recent journalism. What I'll say, the tweet, maybe it was newsworthy. In my view, it was a bad, sour joke. It may have been worth a report the next day. Larissa Behrendt, in response to this, I think people tweet often without thinking about it being public. They live in a sort of pre-tweeting age where they think they're doing it to a friend. It was in response to another Aboriginal
and
friend.
To make it clear, she wasn't watching Q&A at the time.
She wasn't watching
She was
Q&A.
watching Deadwood, and that was the reference to
and the reference
horse
was to
sex.
something that happened, and it was extremely, in my view, extremely bad joke, and I think she shouldn't have made it. As soon as it was on the front page, she apologised. She apologised to Best Price personally and in the paper which published the apology, so it was forced out of her, blah, blah, blah. The thing went on for I think 2 weeks, and then for many days after that, one thing after another, pulling down her character, saying there should be an investigation into her university position, saying she should not be allowed to continue with her role as making a report into Indigenous higher education, saying falsely she tried to ban another writer from an Indigenous paper, saying even Keith Windschuttle, this terrific young Indigenous woman who has a PhD from Harvard, saying she didn't deserve her PhD. On what basis? None. You just can say it. I think it was the most disgusting, irresponsible character assassination. And then Kelly, I mean, this I went in the interview with Mitchell and Kelly. Kelly was even more vehement that it was reasonable to go on about things utterly unconnected to the intervention, about details of Larissa's personal life.
Didn't part of the coverage reveal the disagreements and disconnection between some members of the Indigenous community over the Northern Territory intervention, and isn't that worth talking about?
It hardly mentioned it. It was, if you read, it's hardly mentioned. In fact, there were quite a lot of people who were very angry with Best Price amongst Indigenous people, who thought it was terrible that she was saying that Indigenous women all supported the intervention, because they don't. And the paper hardly covered that aspect of it. Larissa Brent has a lot of respect within those communities and has travelled in the Northern Territory a lot, from what I understand, and she has very strong supporters. They got an occasional word in. But the thing was not about the intervention. It's an interesting question. I would love there to be more reporting of it. It was a consistent attempt to kind of character assassinate. And I think that, I'm so pleased I did write about it, and I, utterly repudiate. The reason I didn't mention it in the thing up the back is that, to be honest, Larissa has had enough. She was so, when I talked to her, she was so clearly kind of upset about it all that I'm trying, I haven't done it now, but because you asked, but I'm trying as far as possible not to go on about that, because, one of my favourite sayings is slander is a hummable tune. Even defending someone in a way by mentioning things brings them back. And, I just hope her life can fully recover from it.
Okay, I'm going to end with Chris Mitchell's words. He said on Saturday, "We are sorry Rob is unhappy with elements of our news coverage over the past decade. The 300 journalists who produce this paper work very hard to lead the news agenda across the continent every day. If Manne, who admits The Australian is the best paper in the country and the only one he cares about, cannot forgive us our flaws, we humbly suggest he moves his subscription to The Age." Isn't it as simple as that? Isn't it just a matter of, if you don't like The Australian, don't read it?
No. And if you don't like Fox News, just turn it off. No. I mean, we live in a democratic culture. Everyone knows that the major organs of radio, television, newspapers affect the political culture. I think growing is the sense of the importance of the media to all of our life as citizens, and political citizens in particular. So The Australian is, one very good news person who's known to you told me he thought it was a strange way of putting it, the most important institution in the country. He said more important than the law courts, more important than the parliament, which I think is an exaggeration. But nevertheless, it's exceptionally important to how our politics goes, for all reasons that I try and document. So it seems to me utterly ridiculous to say it's a private matter, you either like it or you don't. We belong to a common culture, and we need to criticise elements of that culture, not to censor them. I've never tried to censor, anything in the political realm ever. What we need to do is to keep two things: our capacity for criticism, and I have to say, given what I've experienced in the last few days, have to keep our courage up, because bullies try and shut people up, not by censorship, but by fear.
Well, I've done my best to give you a grilling, but let's see if the audience can give it a shot now. Let's go to some questions. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see.
Thank you, Robert. One of the responses that you suggested for the culture of the Australian was for people who had got some bad treatment in publications to bring some defamation actions, and you encouraged people to do so. And I was wondering what sort of people or profile of people you thought might be a good response to that, and do you encourage yourself to do so?
Oh, I didn't encourage anyone to take defamation action. I never would, because in general it's a foolish thing to do unless the claim against you is so terrible that if you don't take action, people assume you must be guilty of it, like Dominic Strauss-Kahn is being accused of being a rapist and he's taking defamation action because if he didn't, people would assume it were true. I haven't encouraged people to take defamation action. I don't intend to at the moment, although I think I've been defamed, but everyone says your life just becomes dominated by this issue, and I would never suggest, except in the most extreme case, for people to take defamation action. Press council action is a different matter.
Okay, next question.
Robert, by having targeted the Australian exclusively and having let the Age off scot-free, haven't you demonstrated a huge double standard?
I mean, I've done one thing. If I'd done the Age and the Australian, why haven't you done the Herald Sun? I mean, I've done one thing. I mean, I obviously have done it because I regard the Australian as a particularly important newspaper, not the best. It's a misunderstanding from Chris Mitchell. I regard it as a particularly important paper, but I also think it's a paper that has done a lot of harm. So I'm not trying to give a balanced portrait of the press in Australia. You do one thing at a time. But clearly, if I gave a picture of the Age, it would have different elements. But I don't, it's just not what I was doing. And I didn't talk about all sorts of things. And it just seems to me one can only do one thing at a time. And clearly you choose what you think to be important. And I've come to the view that the Australian is the most important target for criticism because of the things I've said over 40,000 words.
Okay, who's next?
Robert, you say in your essay that, you say intelligent Australians are concerned. You said that tonight. And you also say in your essay that the Fairfax and the ABC really don't really criticise the Australian. Why do you think that is? And Crikey, which does on occasion scrutinise the Australian, is that not mainstream enough? You don't talk about that.
No, well, I mean, Crikey's, I used to have a phrase which I'm happy to say here, thank God for Crikey, because it's really courageous, and I think that's what we need. So.
Can we put that on a T-shirt?
Yeah. The question of the ABC and Fairfax in regard to the Australian is a very important one. Again, not everyone here will read the Australian regularly. If you read it, you'll find almost daily, but weekly, this sort of characterisation of Fairfax and the ABC as mad left-wing zealots, lampooning caricature, the Age is the Spencer Street Soviet, etc., etc. Clearly, it's clear that the Age, Sydney Morning Herald and the ABC don't want to get... They feel, I think, they want to get down to that level. And that they also, I think, to some extent fear the kind of vituperation they would face if they debate, if they responded to that sort of lampooning. My view is it's wrong, and I think it's wrong in part because I think it does in the end affect their reputation. I think if you keep on saying something, it begins to sort of stick, and I think the ABC has been quite unfairly criticised, and I think it's probably had more of an influence than it ought to, but that's a different argument. But the other thing is that if the Age, Sydney Morning Herald and ABC don't get into these issues, they leave the victims vulnerable. So that, it is particularly dispiriting if something unjust happens for those who kind of, know that it's unjust, but they think they better be quiet about it. When this was going on with Larissa Behrendt, for example, there was, I think, one article in the Sydney Morning Herald which was on her side, but in general it was all given a wide berth. And so victims then feel, to whom do they turn? Because individuals can't do this. Even in a way, Crikey can to some extent, but the really mainstream parts of the media, ABC, Fairfax, I think ought to join in, or to say, not to get to that level, but to do the sort of critical work which I've tried to do in bad news. What
about the argument that they don't see the news value in that it's too niche, that it's just something that sort of media observers are interested in?
Yeah, that's a very common view, and I actually think it's very misleading. I think there is an instinct among many people that the media is extremely important, and I think it's growing. I think there's a sense that our politics passes through a media, in a way much more than it used to, and that I actually think citizens are extremely interested in media questions. I think it's funny, journalists often say, let's not, if we examine things too closely, we're becoming self-referential and self-obsessed. I don't think that's true. Actually, I think the public now knows that media is very interesting. And I think, often when I've gone to public appearances, tonight example, a lot of people turn up because there's a general sense that the flourishing of a democracy, one very important element is a good media and an honest and reliable media. And so I actually just don't believe that it's too self-referential or too niche markety. So I would oppose that, but I might be wrong.
All right, we've got time for 2 more questions. Up the back there.
I'm wondering, this isn't a personal question, but it's an intro to a major question. Have you ever submitted articles on all these debates, Wind Shuttle and Behrendt and all that, which have been, to the Australian, or letters, which have been blatantly rejected even though you put in a lot of time? And do you therefore think in some way that official scrutineers should be appointed for all these very highly politicised debates to tally up the number of articles which are pro or against, which are rejected by Chris Mitchell in some way?
Look, it's in some ways it's just a very narrow question because I've had, strange enough, I was treated very harshly by the Australian until February 2009. Then the editor of Weekend Australian, Nick Cater, came down, made me an offer that I could contribute more or less as what I wanted. When I have contributed things since then, until very recently, they've been accepted. And I don't think there should be anyone over Chris Mitchell's shoulder. I do think that what's happened, because I've criticised them, they've gone slightly crazy. I mean, the bit that Sophie began reading out about the characterisation of the paper, it's as if they wanted to show I was right. The overreaction and the tinge of sort of alarm that they've shown in publishing 14,000 words, and the astonishingly illiberal decision not to publish a reply by me or a letter from any person in my defence, and they put on record that they're not going to have one opinion article in my favour, seems to me, I mean, they sent an email to David McKnight telling him that, seems to me so astonishingly illiberal that I want that to be publicly known, and I think that it is, that is a really serious matter.
Okay, one more question. Up the back there.
As a self-confessed vulgar Marxist, there are 2 questions. As a self-confessed,
you or me?
Me. As a self-confessed vulgar Marxist, who's your favourite, Groucho, Harpo, or Zippo?
That's a hard question.
Yeah, I thought. But the real question is, how have
I
you?
I wanted to answer that.
You have time to answer. How have you personally taken this debate?
Look, there have been a couple of moments when I've been upset. And one actually was when I was not sure whether the Age would take extracts, and when they decided to, I was relieved. But I've taken it pretty well. I've had what I call a lot of batting practice. For 15 years I've been putting up with stuff like this, not at this intensity, but from people. And 15 years ago I would have been devastated by what's happened in the last 3 or 4 days, and I've not been. I've had 1 or 2 difficult moments, but I don't think I'm a naturally thick-skinned person, but if at a certain point you realise that if you're going to do this, you're going to cop it, and I've had a lot of practice at doing it, and so I hope it's clear tonight my morale is fine.
Well, I'm glad your morale is fine and that you have developed a thick skin, because I think I need to get a response from you about Bill Leake's cartoon, which we haven't covered off on, which, of course, was a portrayal of you as the thinker on the toilet.
Shitting,
as you put
reading
it.
The Australian.
I'm just going to hold that up there. What's your official response to that, Robert?
Well, it's interesting. I think that people who do things in bad faith, who draw cartoons for a right-wing newspaper when they're not naturally right-wing, I think they become quite paranoid about criticism. I think they become scattered. I think Bill Leake is doing something which, Guy Rundle said this and I tend to believe it, which in the end he doesn't quite believe in, and thus being confronted by someone perhaps expressing dark fears he might have because he's a talented, intelligent person, I think they become very nasty. I thought it was an exceptionally nasty cartoon, but what can I do about it?
Well, can you all join me in thanking Robert Manne this evening?